Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I am thrilled to have back with us New Jersey Attorney General Matt Platkin. Matt, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Jen.
It's good to have you. You've been a busy guy, filing a lot of lawsuits. Over 20, perhaps?
We've been busy filing lawsuits because the president and his administration have been busy breaking the law. So it's
Absolutely.
our obligation.
Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to most recently.
Well, look, I think you can look at some of the lawsuits we filed, and when we've said since January 20th that if the president breaks the law and hurts the residents of New Jersey, we're not going to hesitate to step in. And
Right.
this conversation sometimes feels abstract about the rule of law, but take the case we filed earlier this month about forced reset triggers, which I don't know that anyone really spent a whole lot of time thinking about, but they're basically devices that can convert a firearm into something more powerful than an M16 military grade machine gun capable of firing 900 rounds a minute. So the federal government doesn't usually play the role of arms dealer, but contradicting decades of their own legal interpretations, they are now in some shadowy settlement with a gun lobby going to distribute 12,000 machine guns to communities across the state, including into New Jersey. Just a couple days ago, we had to file another suit challenging their use of literally a five-word provision buried deep in the OMB regulations that no one has ever used to cancel billions and billions of dollars of grants, firing law enforcement officers, gutting public safety technology, gutting programs that keep fraud out of our federal insurance programs, which I thought was something Doge cared about. Gutting food at food shelters. I mean, this is like what we're talking about here. So these abuses of power, the violations of law, and the harms are really concrete in the lives of New Jerseyans and Americans across the country.
Absolutely. When you file these lawsuits, do they have a good legal argument? Do they have any legal arguments for what they've done? Or they just kind of say the federal government gets to do whatever it wants?
They say variations of that for sure. Look, they have their arguments. Those arguments have overwhelmingly been unpersuasive. Historically, about 20% of the cases against the federal government filed by states are successful. So not the highest batting average historically. In the first Trump administration, states were successful 80% of the time. And in this case, this administration, we've been successful almost 100% of the time. And
Wow.
so you think about that, we're not filing frivolous cases. We're not filing sort
Right.
of edge cases. And we're getting, when I say almost 100, that means we're getting immediate relief, which is an
Right.
extraordinary burden to meet in a case against the United States government. And yet we're meeting it routinely by judges across the ideological spectrum. So it's really alarming what they're doing.
And I think that's important to point out. These are not just Obama judges, as if there were such a thing. These are judges appointed by presidents of both parties. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and first of all, let's just reject this notion that because a president appoints someone, they categorically agree with you if you're on the same side of the political spectrum. I've won cases before some of the most conservative judges appointed by President Trump, and I've lost cases before some of the quote unquote most liberal judges appointed by Joe Biden. These are
Right.
these are distinguished public servants who, by the way, have been threatened personally, and we live that here in New Jersey. We don't need to remind everyone about the tragedy with Judge Salas. The threats on the judiciary, the things Stephen Miller has said about the judiciary, the things J.D. Vance has said about the judiciary, the things President Trump has said about the judiciary are beyond the pale, and they need to stop, period. But
Absolutely.
absolutely, we've seen judges across the ideological spectrum. When we argued the birthright citizenship case at the Supreme Court, Justice Coney Barrett, who, as we know, was appointed by President Trump, was probably the most offended at what the Solicitor General for the United States said when he couldn't even concede that he would follow Supreme Court precedent. This is the Solicitor General of the United States saying that to the nine justices on the highest court in the land. So it's not the case that we're seeing a single judge appointed by President Biden or Obama in all these instances issuing these rulings. We're seeing them across the spectrum. In fact, I think one of the strongest quotes we've gotten in the birthright case was from a judge appointed by President Ronald Reagan, not known as a famous liberal, who said that the birthright citizenship executive order was the most flagrantly unconstitutional thing he's seen in the 40 years he's been on the bench.
Absolutely. Sometimes you hear members of the administration say things like, well, we'll abide by Supreme Court rulings. Is there anywhere in the law books and the Constitution that says it's okay to ignore a lower court ruling?
Maybe if you go to the law school Stephen Miller went to, which is not any law school, you could say that. But you learn on the first day of law school that courts get to say what the law is. And that's the way our constitutional system works. And look, I've disagreed with a lot of decisions from lower courts in my career. Your right then is to appeal it. You can take it up to a higher court. And when the Supreme Court issues its decision, agree with it or disagree with it, you follow it. I certainly did not think the Dobbs decision was rightly decided. I've never once publicly or otherwise said we wouldn't follow it. And that's the difference. If the rule of law is going to mean something, I see these statements on Twitter by administration officials about a quote unquote judicial coup. It's not a coup. We've had the rule of law for the entire history of this nation. That's what separates us. That's what we created in order to not have an actual coup or tyranny, because we created checks and balances that are supposed to be functioning. And right now, they're functioning. So that's the way it's supposed to work.
Asked you about lower court judges who are bearing the brunt of a lot of this because they're the ones to initially hear a motion for a TRO or a preliminary injunction. When they talk about this, are they concerned about their personal safety? Are they concerned about really kind of the assumption that judges should be targeted? What is the reaction on the federal bench? You deal with these folks day in and day out.
They're scared. They're absolutely scared. First of all, they don't have enough resources to protect them. And I think that's true for every public official. I think we need more funding for the marshals. They are incredibly important and great partners. But they're scared. And they have good reason to be scared. I mean, just Judge Salas here, her son Danny, that tragedy was an unspeakable tragedy. And yet here we are having unspeakable tragedy after unspeakable tragedy. We have Speaker Hortman in Minnesota and pizza boxes being sent to judges with Danny's face on it. I can't describe how awful that is and how destabilizing it is to our system of government if people fear for their lives. It's not only going to cause immediate harm or could cause immediate harm to a whole bunch of public servants. It's also going to keep people out of public service altogether.
Yes.
And it's an intimidation tactic that is being used to scare people out of doing what they know is the right thing. And I do think in this country, the rise of political violence should scare every single one of us. That is
Absolutely.
not the mark of a flourishing democracy.
We've also seen something else, which is the arrest of Democratic officials carrying out their duties or people who are perceived as progressives. We saw Judge Dugan in Wisconsin arrested and handcuffed. We saw in New Jersey the mayor of Newark, and we saw Representative MacGyver arrested. The charges were eventually dropped in the first, but the representative had just pled not guilty. First of all, how unprecedented is this? And secondly, what danger does this pose to separation of powers and really the rule of law?
It's a huge threat to the rule of law. If we let the justice system be politicized and weaponized so clearly, and again, I'm not familiar with the facts of every case, but you could take the case of Mayor Baraka, which was dismissed 12 days after charge, quote, for the interest of moving forward, which is not a standard I've ever seen in any Justice Department manual for dismissing a case. The judge in that case rightfully, I think, excoriated the office about the way they handled it. And you see Congresswoman MacGyver, which I've said publicly, the decision to charge a public official while exercising legislatively authorized oversight, you have to have very clear evidence of criminal conduct and intent. And that decision is an extraordinary one. And obviously, we'll see how the case plays out. But the broader point about how the Justice Department is functioning, I will tell you firsthand, is making people less safe in my state. We historically have had very close relationships across political administrations. We've had it in Trump administration, Biden, Obama, across federal, state, and local law enforcement lines. That is something as a nation after 9/11, we worked really hard to make sure all law enforcement is communicating so we don't miss threats. That is not the case right now. The Department of Justice is preoccupied with political agendas and not with doing the hard work of law enforcement, which I will tell you, the federal law enforcement officers that I deal with are genuinely concerned about because I think they know when these communication channels break down, bad things happen. And my only hope is that it's not something serious. And if it is, I know who will be responsible.
We have seen in California the unprecedented deployment of Marines on the streets of Los Angeles and the nationalization of the National Guard, who to this day are deployed when there is absolutely nothing going on whatsoever. We also saw this very open-ended executive decree, I won't even dignify it as an order, saying that the president feels like he can deploy and nationalize a National Guard anywhere in America where there are even protests. He doesn't even specify violent protests. How concerned are you about that? And is New Jersey prepared to litigate and prevent that from happening in your state?
Well, we've supported California in their litigation. Let me first just say I feel for these Marines and National Guardsmen and women. They signed up to protect this nation. And
Yeah.
I think they are being put in an awful and potentially dangerous position. And so I feel for them because they didn't ask for this. And
Right.
those Marines are young men and women who signed up to defend this nation against foreign threats. That's what they did. The Posse Comitatus Act says they are not there for general policing. And the Los Angeles Police Department, just like the 42,000 officers in New Jersey, we know how to handle protests. We've been doing it forever. And we had, even post Floyd in New Jersey, we had very peaceful protests here. Our law enforcement knows how to do it. They are trained, they are experts, and I trust them to do their job. I trust them to hold accountable if people are breaking the law. The protests should be peaceful, but I trust them to do their job. And when you send in people in military gear, trained in whether it be in the Marines or in the Guard, you're asking for escalation. And I do not understand why the President of the United States wants to escalate a situation rather than de-escalate a situation, potentially putting servicemen and women and the general public at greater risk. And yes, we have supported California's lawsuit. I think the idea that you would come into a city in a state and disregard the governor's viewpoint on whether the Guard should be mobilized is astonishing. It's extraordinary. There are very limited circumstances where that is appropriate. None of them present here. And we'll see how the litigation plays out. But I think as a general point, it's incredibly unfair to the brave men and women who signed up to defend this country to put them in that position. And it's only going to serve to try to escalate the any kind of potential activity around the protests.
I want to wrap up with this question. We have very violent actions by ICE of the kind we haven't seen. Masked people in unmarked cars. They often refuse to identify themselves. People don't know whether they're legitimately law enforcement. How concerned are you about that? And also about the effect it may be having on people who now may not want to report domestic violence, may not want to cooperate with the police as a witness. Tell us a little bit about what threats and danger to public safety this poses.
Look, we have rights in this country. And, Stephen Miller may not like that, but there's a reason why the amendments to the Constitution exist. And they have said time and again, their focus is on violent criminals. Great. New Jersey, we cooperate all the time on removing violent criminals. But let me give you a very real case to show you how reckless what they're doing is. So we had a case. A woman was stabbed in the neck by a partner, domestic violence case. Thank God she survived, and he was charged with attempted murder. She was obviously a critical witness in that prosecution. She was undocumented. Normally, what would happen until this administration, including in the first Trump administration, if you are a witness in a case against a violent criminal, they'll give you protective status so they don't deport you, so that we can't prosecute the person who's attempted to murder someone. Well, not in this case. They picked the woman up, and our case was potentially going to unravel. Normally, then, I would call the U.S. attorney, or our offices would call each other and we'd sort it out. Because they don't want to talk to us, that couldn't happen. So eventually, ICE got a call from a reporter and decided that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze on this one. But that's not how justice should work. And imagine now if you're somebody who is a victim of domestic violence or human trafficking or any kind of crime, and you or your family member has undocumented status and you've done nothing wrong, you might think twice about whether I come forward. That's why
Absolutely.
the common sense protections we have in place work. That's why police chiefs that I talk to that work in large communities with large immigrant populations say they couldn't do their jobs in January and February because no one would talk to them. They couldn't tell them about where the gang members were operating. These edicts, which apparently include Stephen Miller telling ICE officers and superior ICE officers from across the country that they don't know how to do their jobs and blaming them for not reaching his made-up quota of people that they have to deport every day. It's putting them in a very difficult place. I do feel for our law enforcement officers, but people have rights. And when you target whole communities in this way, you make us all less safe. And we are seeing that play out in New Jersey and in states across the country right now.
Well, thank you, AG Platkin. It's always a pleasure. You do give us a bird's eye view of what's going on the ground, and our viewers should understand if it's happening in New Jersey, it's happening all across the country. New Jersey is special. I was born there, but it's not so unique. And states and millions of people are experiencing the same. So thank you. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Jen. And you're welcome back in New Jersey anytime.
Absolutely. Take care.